if there's an issue, just use that. Okay, you all ready?
Is this one?
Yeah, there's a switch on.
Got it.
I'm sure you're capable.
All right.
Hi, welcome to the next talk. If you think this guy sucks and want to watch robot battles, nothing personal, this is my entry. We'll be doing this out in the pool area until we get bored of it. Coming up next is Dan Tentler with How Not to Infosec. So give him a big round of applause.
Right. Fun times. So yeah, he isn't wrong. My talk is actually entirely full of fail. So yeah, this is for fun while we were setting up. This is an ongoing piece of research which I might actually make a talk about. This is if anybody heard the stories recently about that sign in Atlanta, Georgia that got goatseed. These are other signs in the country that are still vulnerable to the same attack, and just for fun. Yeah, lol. So yeah, that's good times. Anyhow, now on to the meat. Right, so how not to infosec. I'm Vis. Today I'll be talking entirely about mistakes, which is something I've seen very, very rarely in infosec in its entirety. Ones that I've made, ones that coworkers have made, ones that clients have made, employers, other companies I've seen in the public, stuff that I've seen on Twitter and in the media, you name it, just like this giant flaming fail talk. I'll be talking about mistakes that are entirely preventable and could have been prevented with little to no effort, basically. So this is the obligatory About Me slide. Few people care about this. If you want to stalk me on the internet, that's how. This isn't the important part. The important part is that everyone faces problems and everyone knows how to deal with them. Several years ago, for anybody that went to DEF CON, you may remember that Adam Savage actually took the stage and he presented specifically on the topic of how failure made him the man he was today, and how failing fast and learning what not to do next time was tantamount to his working. Fail, Mike, is fail. Anyway, yeah, so taking his philosophy to heart, basically, alright, I'm switching mics, this is dumb. Hold on. Ooh, that works. Nice, now it's a party. Alright, so let me try to, in the spirit of fail. Right, okay, good. Anyway, so taking Adam's philosophy to heart, I built this talk to basically articulate sort of if-then conditionals for security problems where the then is your company will end up in the news or gets hacked to oblivion or goes out of business or what have you, or mail spools end up on pastebin. So the goal here is effectively to help help out the crowd by process of elimination. So if I can show you what not to do, it'll help narrow down what you should do. So instead of telling you what to do or what's cool, I'll say, no, I stepped over here on a landmine and it blew off my legs, don't be me. So this is actually really neat. This is a Tumbleweed Minesweeper that a guy in Kabul built. It's made out of bamboo and like these little plastic things that he invented, and it's carried by the wind. So he's let it loose in the deserts of Kabul, and it runs over landmines and takes out landmines, which is really cool because it helps keep things like kids walking over to landmines and pets and other people or what have you. Like, it's a minesweeper and it's entirely automated. You just let it go in the wind, and it's pretty cool. So I thought that was pretty inspirational. I thought that was very parallel to the talk. So in my security experience, I've sadly experienced quite a lot. So my intention here is to basically show you where I stepped on these mines and how my legs got blown off and all the colorful fun guts of my legs. Where I saw others do the same, where I saw craters and other little flags that were left by other people where mines were, and effectively this is sort of we're all on the same team in the room, we all have the same goal, let's all internet together. And the first really fun talking point that I'll mention is that there's a lot of people that come from the military that believe that because they pushed a broom or drove a truck or did something in the military that had absolutely nothing to do with computers, that they have like a golden ticket to work in information security. And yeah, so I want to start with like a hypothetical story. So let's say that you have an FBI IT manager, a sheriff IT manager, a Fortune 500 IT manager, a startup DevOps guy, and a pen tester all walk into a bar together, and they sit down and they start talking. And everyone works for an organization that runs a Windows stack, right? Active Directory, Exchange, IIS, you name it. So the pen tester says, hey, did you guys hear about MS-15034, that new IIS denial of service vulnerability that came out like 2 months ago? The DevOps guy says, yeah, we have Kibana running on top of Logtash and Suricata. We're watching it get dropped by idiots in China that are attacking us, and our tools are auto-adding it to our firewall rules, and it's really amazing. It's all free. You guys should check this out. It's built into mod security, and props to Lei for helping us out with that. The FBI agent folds his arms and says, that's classified. The sheriff nervously folds his arms, looks at the FBI guy, and says what he said. The Fortune 500 IT manager says, oh man, law enforcement looks all twitchy and nervous. I better not say anything without talking to counsel. And the pen tester says, fucking all of you guys have sent me mail in the last week, and your mail headers tell me you're running Exchange. Like, this shit isn't a secret. Why are you making it a secret? Like, and meanwhile, the SEA and the GOP are looting everyone and stealing shit, and mail spools are showing up on Pastebin, while you have one guy in the room saying we should all work together, and everyone else in the room saying, no, that's classified. So that's contributing to the problem. So hiding mistakes because they might make you look bad, when the price is overt massive compromise, you're generally going to have a bad time. So classifying things as secret only to claim that you have secrets doesn't make you look cool. It hurts you, and it makes you look desperate for attention. So we're all on the same side, so let's take that into consideration as we roll into this talk, right? So we start with large, ridiculous public fails. You might recognize a lot of the logos on this slide. And so these things are effectively large how not to InfoSec sort of posters for everyone to follow, right? So this list of companies is getting bigger, and every year it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. In the last 5 years, we've seen effectively more than doubling of massive public breaches year over year, and the overwhelming majority of these were really preventable. Everything from preventing very simple SQL injection to looking at log files to storing data in not plain text. Having competent staff is usually a really good one. Even including doing intrusion detection or monitoring egress traffic at like a base 101 level. So this is a fancy graphic that I didn't make. And this is just from April 2015 back to 2013. So this is 2 years of data, and this is like billions of customer records that were owned because of simple stuff like this. And this is only the people that chose to disclose, and this was only the things that affected customer records. So like if your credit card got popped or something like that, right? So clearly what we've been doing now hasn't really been working. It's not been as effective as it could be, and obviously the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So we should consider doing something different. We're getting better, but we're still hampered by various wet blankets. The following is a compendium of specific examples of when doing something, specific examples was when something that was done affected security in a very negative and dramatic way. These examples will be from a variety of perspectives, the pen tester, the IT department, the networking team, and the vendors, and things like that. So the goal here is not to, the goal here is effectively to describe what not to do in any given scenario. So we'll start with massive engineering fails. Lack of foresight, deliberate misconduct, charlatanism, lawyers, reasons outside of security why security wasn't a consideration, and there's a lot. So sadly, I can't afford to issue everyone in the room helmets. I really hope you've brought your own. So first, we'll start with deliberate SSL man-in-the-middle. If your organization decides to man-in-the-middle SSL connections, and the argument is that it's for advertising, marketing, or collecting user data, as a security person in the room, effectively, it's your job to tell these guys this is a really bad idea and we should consider not doing it. Some of you may remember an incident when a company called Superfish recently basically installed more or less malware on every Lenovo laptop that they were shipping. Their excuse was effectively that they wanted to do what Google was doing and do SSL man-in-the-middle to capture the things that people were searching for and the text that people were shipping back and forth to the internet for whatever reason, so that they could be targeted for advertising purposes. Superfish didn't take into account what would happen if bad guys actually found their cert. and the bad guys did find their cert, and the bad guys misused their cert. And they were more or less shamed off of the internet publicly. So lesson number 1, don't invade people's privacy for monetary gain. Stop it if you can. If you can't stop it, make it clear what people are doing is bad news and try and get it in writing. Also, don't be surprised if your tech gets hijacked and is used in a very evil way because you didn't consider that you were enabling attackers to do the same evil stuff you were doing for the purposes of advertising. So rootkits are fun. We're not going to be happy unless we can DRM the user's computer in addition to the music, right? So a while back, a lot of you probably heard this one already. Sony had the genius idea of installing malicious code on audio CDs that would install itself on the computer if people were putting their audio CDs in their computer to, rip music or listen to it or what have you. So it would phone home intelligence on the user, and it would modify their computer to prevent it from copying audio and other things like that. So again, if you ever sat in a meeting and someone suggests that we should install software on the customer's computers for the sake of DRM and copy protection, you're effectively, if you're the security person in the room, it's your job to yell and shout and make a scene and say, this is a really fucking bad idea. So as the attorney would put it, let's not do anything that would get us sued. So lesson number 2, straightforwardly, just don't install malware on your customers' machines. Right? Simple. You'd think this was straightforward, right? So, then you have the typical jealous spouse mode where, I can't feel safe and secure unless I know every single one of your keystrokes. And anybody in the room remember Carrier IQ? Carrier IQ is fun. So, like, watching your users type onto their mobile devices and eavesdropping their keystrokes isn't really cool, no matter how you try and slice it. A while back, a company called Carrier IQ did this with Android phones the same way the Superfish did this with the Lenovo's. They installed software at the factory before it was sold. The phones were sold to consumers, and companies like Verizon and AT&T shipped these phones to consumers, and it was installed by default. It turns out later the Carrier IQ was funded by a company that was known to be a CIA front for interesting research. They also got effectively shamed off of the internet. So lesson number 3 is simply don't keylog your customers. If they find out that you're keylogging them, you're going to have a bad time. Another great point here is if you're the blue team person, or if you're part of a blue team in an organization, it might be an idea to take into consideration people leaving password files on their desktops or on file shares with just like a text file or an Excel spreadsheet full of passwords. I can tell you from personal experience that I love these as the bad guy when I'm paid to do a pen test or an assessment, and I loot somebody's email box or I find these on somebody's desktop. It is supremely helpful to me as the bad guy. So routinely, folks that work in offices write passwords on sticky notes, or they put them on whiteboards, or they put them on file sharing. They put them on file shares, or text files on the desktop, easy to find places. So another thing to consider here is that effectively your inbox is also an easy storage solution for this sort of stuff. And the main company file share is because everyone has access to it and things like that. At least one employee has done this at every single engagement I've ever conducted, and it's been super helpful in every engagement I've ever done. So, and usually it's been like the head of development or like the second in command of IT, like somebody that should know better. And every single time it is one of the huge leaps and bounds that I can make to go from barely having any access to effectively owning the whole company. Another really fun thing here is that organizations that set like your typical, you should change this passwords, like welcome123 or change me or what have you. A lot of organizations will set a password like that, like Tuesday #1 or Monday #5 or something like that. And the people will never change that password. When it comes time to change a password, like in 90 days or 180 days or whenever the password policy says you have to change your passwords, they just change the number on the end from a 5 to a 6. So really easy to guess, really easy to brute force. Or maybe in this one case, the specific guy, he used Microsoft OneNote, and he had a OneNote file full of all of his credentials for all of his networking equipment, all the database servers, all the production gear, everything in OneNote. And I guess he had like a laptop upgrade or something. He chose to zip up all of his OneNotes into a zip file and then email them to himself. And I found them. So I went from one day from like, oh cool, I fished one guy and I have a shell in his box, to, oh, now I have passwords to the entire infrastructure. Like in one step, I went from like I kind of have access to, now I own the whole shop. So don't presume that your email box is a safe place to store clear text passwords, because I'll find them and I'll exploit them and then I'll put you in a talk. right? So lesson number 4, who's Stephen Colbert got it right. Like, treat passwords like dick pics. Don't leave them lying around for people to find. Presume people will go looking for them, and when they're found, you're going to be really embarrassed and you're going to have a bad time. So almost every company I've red teamed for, as well as Sony has been in the news recently, has had this problem, and it's something that people talk about in the office, but I haven't really heard so much like in talks. The ocean of a file share conundrum is basically you have like a 4 terabyte array, and everyone in the company has full read-write access to this array, and everyone reads writes stuff like HR, finance, the board, the executives. They all work in this giant open file share, and everyone has read-write access to everything else. So you have like desktop backups and people's a variety of other backups, and people's personal stuff all lives in this huge file share. So if you catch it after hours and you just run a search on it, you name it, passwords. What else was a good one? Passport photos, driver's license photos, people's personal stuff, mortgage documentation, like stuff that shouldn't even be at work in the first place. So it's kind of a gold mine there. I found things like bank transfers for $500,000 and up with signed, like people's signatures and the names of everyone who's on the board. I found documentation for companies that have sold or bought either components of their business or bought whole other banks. And all that documentation was just on a file share that anybody could read. So if you presume that the attackers are at least as good as us, it's got to be considered that this is probably one of the first places they're going to go look. So take that into consideration. If you have any leverage in your organization over the people that keep track of what goes on these mammoth file shares, if I'm the bad guy that gets hired to attack your shop, that's one of the first places I'm going to look. So segment it in some way. It'd probably be a good idea to like wrap your file shares in granular permissions of some kind, at least down to like the departmental level. I mean, look what happened to Sony. That's exactly what happened. The attackers got in, they found this giant file share with everything, and they just looted it. So lesson number 5, wrap your huge file shares with permissions of some kind, right? So this is a really fun one. This is a big one that I've seen in a bunch of places. Network equipment that runs day-to-day at 90% CPU or 90% TCP session saturation. So some of you might know what that means in the crowd, but for those that don't, let me explain. Some networking gear has a low ceiling for how many concurrent TCP sessions it can handle, and when that reaches its limit, it starts to drop sessions that come in, which means SSH sessions die, video sessions die, VoIP calls drop, and like the network starts getting really flaky and starts misbehaving. And this makes people really angry, especially if you're using VoIP, because like important phone calls drop. Down. Yeah, stuff goes down, and people have a bad time. So if you're in the networking group and you're knowingly letting your gear run that hot, you should strongly consider resigning, especially if you're part of a billion-dollar publicly traded company. You're putting the entire organization at risk on a daily basis. I understand that budgets can be tough, but knowingly letting your hardware run that hot is putting effectively the entire organization at risk. And if you're in charge of security or in charge of networking in that organization, the last place you want to be is sat in front of the board, explaining to the board why you knowingly let the router that connects your office to your data center run at 90% CPU, and you did nothing about it, and then it continues to go down, and the developers having trouble. And the board's going to ask, like, why are we letting you be in charge of our networking gear if you don't give a shit about it? The other fun thing to do here is, if you're on the security side of the house, you will hear from the networking side of the house that you're not allowed to scan that particular piece of equipment. You're not allowed to scan that segment of the network because you might bring something down. Well, that is generally a gigantic indicator of, look, if your $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 firewall can't withstand me on a laptop with Nmap, get out. Like, I'll do your networking. Get out. You're an idiot. Sorry, leave. Like lesson 6, if your firewall can't deal with an Nmap scan, get a new firewall. If your network engineers try to defend that position in any way by running the gear at 90% saturation and somehow they claim it's okay, get new network engineers. So, and then on the same, or on a slightly different side of that coin, this coin has more than 2 sides. An organization that deliberately runs its gear at 90% CPU or 90% TCP session saturation, specifically so that they can claim security can't scan this, which I've encountered multiple times. It's so sensitive, you can't scan it. No, we're not allowed to do audits on this equipment. So
So it can't be audited by security, or nothing on the other side of the link is allowed to be accessed or scanned because it might hurt the firewall. So if you've experienced this in your organization, then you're in kind of dire circumstances, because as a security professional in the room, you're literally at the mercy of a group of people who have positioned themselves between you and being successful at your job. So far, in every case that I've seen this or heard about it, the people in charge of the networking equipment are underqualified or have no place touching networking equipment to begin with. It's a precarious place to be in because your successfulness in your job is being limited by people who won't let you touch gear that you're responsible for in terms of security. So you have to, it's a really bizarre place that you're in. You have to deal with either social engineering the group into letting you conduct scans somehow, or to replace the underpowered equipment. So it's this bizarre, like suddenly you can't just be a security engineer, now you have to be a politician. So you're effectively up against people that are like career politicians. They will fiercely defend themselves because their goal is to hide the fact that they don't know what they're doing, and your security scanning will illuminate the fact that they don't know what they're doing. So they will fight tooth and nail to keep you from doing your job because it will prove that they're not doing theirs. So don't let, lesson 7, don't let the dirt metastasize. If that cancer grows deep, it's nearly impossible to get rid of. Don't let underqualified people dictate how security works. That's a tall order, I know. But I have the burn scars to talk about it. So cross-contamination is a fun one. Network segmentation is really simple. To tell a very short story, one of the last engagements I did, there was a floor on the building that had itself VLANed to the production equipment, which basically means all of the fun security implementations, all the policies that were written, all the rules that were thrown down, the governance department had all this oversight, and there were months and months and months of planning to create an environment where you can safely get from the office to the production equipment in some way, was entirely circumvented by the network group because they decided that was too much trouble and they were lazy. So they set up everybody on a particular floor. If you were on that floor, you can get directly to like production database servers, production web servers, production app servers. So I popped a bunch of shells on that floor. Like, why are you wasting time with policies if you're going to circumvent them, right? So it's on practically every assessment I've ever done, there's always been some sort of backdoor in this regard. There's always been some sort of bizarre network segmentation. Like, they just didn't say anything because there's no oversight, because typically, the security department or the networking department tend to be sort of at the top of the stack there. There's nobody cross-checking their work necessarily, unless your org is big enough to have multiple networking departments or multiple security departments. In most cases, it's 1 and 1. So they'll do it and they're going to get away with it and nobody will notice until some asshat like me comes by and does a pen test and points it out. So lesson 8, effectively don't trust hosts on the LAN just because they're on the LAN. If a bad guy gets control of that host, then the bad guy can potentially get control of everything that host can touch. So if you have bypasses on your LAN, you're probably going to have a bad time. So here's a password reuse. Let's beat a dead horse. Let's beat a picture of a dead horse. Let's beat the guy beating the picture of a dead horse. So password reuse is a hilariously old topic that somehow always keeps coming up. With the introduction of a tool like Mimikatz, password reuse really becomes a problem because instead of dealing with short passwords, you can have really complex passwords that are 30 characters long. But if you're using the same complex password on host A as host B, which is in a different domain, but the passwords are the same, and I use Mimikatz to get password A, I'm going to use that password to try and get into host B. So for those not familiar with Mimikatz, basically what it does is it exploits a scenario within Windows that causes Windows to store the clear text version of your password in RAM. And it just goes to RAM and just plucks it out of RAM. So you don't need to crack passwords really much anymore if you have access to the domain controller. You can literally talk from the domain controller to a host and say, hey host, run this PowerShell script. And it says, here are passwords, have fun with them. So it's really neat. It helps considerably. So I just mentioned one organization I was able to jump from their corporate domain to their super secure production domain because all of the sysadmins reused their passwords. So I own several workstations, and those several workstations got me multiple sets of credentials to talk to the production environment. So lesson number 9, don't use the same password for Active Directory as your Cisco equipment or other domains. If your host compromised, assume that your login creds get compromised as well. And if your login credentials are compromised, you have to assume that if they're being used elsewhere, the attackers are going to figure that out and abuse it. This is a fun one. I was actually, I used to do this back in my sysadmin days. So it's really cool that your boxes have 5,000 days of uptime. And it's really awesome that like, yeah, stability, but you're running kernel 2.4 or 2.2. That means it's trivial for people to break into it. And I've seen this a lot mainly at financial organizations that they have this abject unwillingness to reboot anything, especially if it's for the sake of security or patching. They appear to be like completely, like overtly allergic to rebooting. So while not rebooting certainly helps with your uptime, it tells the attackers how old your infrastructure is, and it greatly aids into breaking into those particular systems. So a 15-year-old operating system, Java and Flash from 5 years ago, antivirus that hasn't been updated since 2006, and this list is long and hairy and ridiculous. The most recent occurrence of which I saw was that an organization had 15 or so Foundry switches as their core switching fabric, and they hadn't rebooted them in 3 years. So the last time they did reboot them, they did them all at once, and the reason that I was able to sort of discern that fact was that they after this incident, which I'm about to describe, happened, they admitted that they run this script every night at midnight, which connects to the switches and pulls config off them with text, like just straight up SSH in, show, run, whatever, pull it off, dump it to a file. At some point, we got called in to do incident response, and every single switch went down in a row, one by one, until all 14 or 15 switches were all down. And as it turns out, that there was a memory leak that was released several years before, and it had been so long since they had patched these switches, they denial of service themselves because of their unwillingness to patch like critical infrastructure within their organization for something as simple as just having a memory leak. It bit them on the ass, and it cost them several $1 million because they were hosting people that do stock trading. Sadly, the engineering people in that organization are still there, and they weren't fired on the spot. So maybe there's another opportunity for that particular monster to show its head. So lesson 10, stability is more important than uptime. Reboot your shit and patch it, or you're going to have a bad time. So this is a good one. Organizations that spend all of their man hours meticulously grooming Office documents, usually for compliance or audit reasons, instead of actually conducting any kind of security of any kind. They're not actually doing anything in the documents that they're claiming to do. And from what I can tell, enough of the auditors don't bother looking past the documentation to validate that stuff is actually happening, that a lot of places get away with this. They spend all their time, the security organizations spend 100% of the time with their faces down in Excel and MS Word, and never in a shell or writing code. So one org that I'm aware of would take a pen test report and create an action plan from them, and then when they realized how much the remediation was going to cost, they spent a month strategically changing the language of the report and the language of the policies to make it look like they passed all the auditing. So like, here's a 130-page pen test report, and they literally did next to nothing. They changed the policy and they changed the audit requirements so that they just barely passed by the skin of their teeth. And somehow this is okay. And they're like, we're doing security. I'm going, no, I need scotch desperately. So they just squeaked by, and they spent months changing these documents. And like, shops like this are why the security reactions Tumblr exists. So lesson 11, if you actually have to do stuff, you actually have to do stuff to make security work. None of that stuff that happens in MS, or none of that stuff ever happens in the MS suite. Like, security doesn't happen in Office. It doesn't happen in Exchange. It doesn't happen in Excel. It happens in shell prompts, and it happens in code, and it happens in hardware. No Microsoft Word document or Excel spreadsheet has ever fixed a security posture problem, and none ever will. So please take this into account when you go back to work on Tuesday and shake people. Shake them. Anybody that's familiar with the term defenestration, that's also an option. So these are the droids you're looking for. This is good. Sometimes the answer is literally right under your nose. So from time to time, security researchers will feel generous, and they will find something that they decide is significant, and they will submit it to your organization. The good guy types will contact the manufacturer of hardware or software, and they will say that there's some sort of critical vulnerability, just to help make life more secure. Sometimes the vendor listens, and sometimes they don't, right? So we're building up the whole responsible disclosure discussion. This is an example of when they don't listen. There's a sign manufacturer, some of you may be aware of at this point, a small one that makes these massive LED billboards. Their configuration is basically a Cradlepoint modem or some other piece of consumer equipment as the gateway to the systems that run the sign, a Windows XP box, .xp, I'll emphasize that, and an access camera that are sitting behind this piece of consumer gear. The company sets default passwords, like a lot of them do, and in this case they have two options. One of them is, we will take care of this sign for you and we will be the custodians of the things that go to it. It is not publicly accessible. And the other is, here's a sign, have fun. So anybody hear about that sign in Georgia recently? Big, no, maybe kind of, yeah. So there's this giant, like 200-foot LED billboard sign in Georgia that somebody found the credentials to, which I will share are really, really bad. I won't give you guys the credentials, but if you can find the company name, then you know the credentials. They put Goatsy up on this sign in this really popular corner in a suburb of Georgia, and it made the news, and people were saying that the FBI and DHS were involved, and blah, 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 blah. So this screenshot here that I have was an email response that I got from the company to whom I tried to disclose the problem. I think this came in 2 days after the sign hack happened. And on April 8th, originally, it was a month before anything happened, I wrote them this long email saying, hey, I found your signs, they're on the internet, they're all default creds. Like the cameras that I had up before I started speaking were several of those signs. The cameras are ownable if you know the default creds to the camera. You also know the default creds to the sign. And the cameras, and I found this is interesting, the cameras are running embedded Linux over MIPS, and Metasploit has MIPS payloads. The cameras, if you log in as admin, have an upload functionality. So if you do the math, MSF Venom, MIPS payload, upload, run, you have root on a camera. None of these things log. There's no forensics happening here. You have, like, for everybody that remembers the Karna botnet, the Karna botnet was like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of compromised, I think there were cameras on the internet that were doing the bidding of some bad guy. And it was entirely because, you know, cameras, default passwords, no logging, no security, fun times. So this is, you know, and to this guy's credit, he actually called me like several days ago, and he says, like, I just wanted to make sure you understand, I'm in the business networking side of the organization. I don't work on the signs. That's a whole different department. I'm not sure why they don't want to talk to you, but I wanted to let you know that there's at least some people in the organizations that care about this stuff, just sadly not the people that matter so much. So this guy went out of his way to help, so I have to give him credit for that. I wanted to assuage any like internet ire that might go his way for not helping, because he's in the position of there's another part of the company that made a mistake and his hands are tied and all he can do is suggest stuff and they just ignore him. So like lesson 12, when a security researcher contacts your company to tell you about a problem, it means not only does that person know about it, it means many other people know about it. They're not saying anything. In the deliberation that I've had with the different people on the internet and Twitter and this guy, I'm like the 6th or the 7th person to have reported this problem to them. I just happened to be the lucky enough to be the last guy that reported it to them before there was a big PR thing like Goatsy on a sign in downtown Georgia. So that's the only reason my name is attached to this in any way. It's a really good idea to take these security folks seriously if they contact your organization and try and tell you that there's stuff wrong. They're trying to help. Even if you don't intend to fix the problem, you might want to at least take them seriously, because stuff like this might happen where the security researcher will say, hey, there's this company that I tried to help, and they literally give no fucks, and that's a problem for a lot of people, especially people that spent maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars on these mammoth signs they sell. What they're usually telling you is that your pants are down and you should probably see about pulling them back up. So another gig I did was for to help a company establish its SOC. They had a moderately developed security program. They had a SIM. They had some procedures in place and things like that. But during that gig, there was one guy who would log into the SIM, highlight 2,000 to 10,000 alerts in the SIM, and just delete them, like at a time, like Control A, boop. So I thought it was pretty astonishing, and I sort of went white in the face when I found this out, and I watched him over his shoulder do it over and over again every day. So I'm fairly certain the guy still works there, astonishingly, and this guy would just delete thousands of alerts without any review whatsoever of any kind. Of course, as incidents would happen, there would be nothing in the tool that we were using to track network forensic happenings. So we'd find compromised hosts, and there'd be no evidence to speak of how they got compromised or what hosts they were talking to on the internet. And we're pulling our hair out trying to figure out where, how many hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars were spent on this SIM tool, and how many people have full-time jobs doing nothing but maintaining this tool. And here's one guy in the SOC just deleting all the evidence of badness happening in the entire organization. So people are scratching their heads. How on earth did these bad guys get into stuff? How did they get past our tools? And it turns out when you point at a guy on staff and say, maybe this guy is actively helping the bad guys, I don't like that so much. It gets very colorful. So lesson 13, make sure that your security staff knows that there are consequences to helping attackers, especially if they're doing it out of their own laziness. In situations like that, it's a good idea to make an example out of these people. I mean, it's mean, but put yourself in the CISO position. Put yourself as the guy that needs to talk to the board. You're going to be sat in front of a board of people that are conducting the business, and they have tens of millions of dollars in budget, and you have to explain to this board why somebody on your staff was actively deleting evidence that would normally be used to find bad guys that committed felonies. So again, you're going to have a bad time. And now the fun part. The pen tester fails. Let me play you the song of my people. Yay, the GIF is GIFing. Yeah. So we move on to the part of the talk here where we talk about attackers failing really, really hard. It's easy to talk smack, as a pen tester, it's really easy to talk smack about customers and clients that fail miserably and how they're doing security wrong and things like that, and huge public engineering fails like I've described from the point of view of an attacker. But make no mistake, the attackers have derp too. They have quite a lot of derp. Let me sing you the song of my people. So, as it turns out, using mass scan on a client probably isn't a good idea if you have it wrenched all the way up. Firewalls that have deep packet inspection turned on, or next generation firewalls that have a bunch of bells and whistles turned on, literally never take into account the fact that the firewall is going to get scanned, and not always by the good guys. So it's entertaining for the folks in the room that remember when SYN cookies started making it into the Linux kernel. Like, they were invented to fix this problem, and now the vendors have undone that. They've basically Control-Z'd security in the kernel for the sake of adding line items to a sales sheet for firewalls. Now, there are firewall vendors that actually think this is a security feature to listen on all ports, for example. Like if anybody's ever scanned, I think Checkpoint is one of them, and there's a couple other ones that they think that, oh yeah, this is going to confuse the port scanners. You do a port scan on something and it tells you that every single port is open. If you do that with Nmap, that firewall is going to have a bad time. So lesson 14, presume that your clients have guys on their team that run their gear at 90%. Presume that Nmap-T4 will take down infrastructure. Also realize that some genius firewall firmwares will create sessions for UDP traffic as well. So if you do a UDP scan, that's another surefire way of ending up having a bad time. So as a paid attacker, you also have to take into consideration that not everyone is going to properly configure web servers or logging servers or things of that nature, SIMs, database servers. In almost every case, pointing a web app scanner at a site and walking away is generally a bad idea, especially if that's the extent of the work that you put into the test. Let's see, what's happening on the back end is that every 404, 500, 200, and every other log message that you're creating is landing in a log somewhere. And if the client is following the frustratingly bizarre school of thought where /var is for some reason a 2 gig partition, you're going to fill up that partition with Apache or Nginx logs, and it'll cause the box to tip over. The same goes for IIS hosts who make a 10 gig D drive and for some reason stick IIS and all of its logs on the D drive. In addition to other things like SQL files. So usually when those boxes go down during a pen test, clients are left with a bad taste in their mouth, and you're unlikely to see return business, especially if you cause a production outage. So lesson 15, don't throw the kitchen sink at your client unless you know that they can take it. Make sure to ask questions during the scoping call about how their logging is configured, where they store databases. Find the sysadmins that set up those 2 gig var partitions and shake them. There's going to be a lot of shaking of people. On rare conditions, when a customer has externally facing assets configured to authenticate against Active Directory, you run the risk of locking users' accounts if you're doing brute forcing of any kind and causing work outages. If you're trying to brute force some person in finance and they're working on the company's quarterly budget and their machine locks up because their account is locked, they're going to get angry about it. I'm pretty sure it's rare to actually find a shop that has this type of setup where, like, if you brute force exchange, then it will cause people's accounts to get locked. But they are out there, and I've heard about them. You run the risk of locking the account. The risk of locking the account is higher if you do brute forcing from the inside, to be sure. Almost everything on the inside is going to authenticate against Active Directory, and you'll lock accounts very, very quickly. I found it's easier to use something like Mimikatz on a shared workstation and work your way up to being a domain admin than it is to try and brute force anything to begin with. Once you have domain admin and all the credentials, you don't really need to brute force anymore, because if you have domain admin, you could just target a workstation or a user and say, I want that person's creds, and Mimikatz will give them to you. So lesson 15, hit them where they're soft, not where they're expecting you. Brute forcing should really be kind of a last-ditch effort to begin with. So occasionally, mistakes are made. Perhaps you're using a system that's configured to use multiple identities. Perhaps on the system, this is a system that you're using to conduct phishing expeditions, phishing campaigns. And perhaps the drop-down window that you select to change your identity is directly above or below the one that you're using normally day to day. So maybe one client accidentally phishes another. Maybe you send the phish from your personal email instead of the fake one that you've created. These things tend to happen. The fun part about this is that companies rarely actually follow up on the phishing campaigns. If the account the phish came from looks legitimate, they will presume that that account got hacked, and they will not think anything of it. If they even have a response. It's usually just adding a filter to the mail server or whatever mail processing systems they use to make sure that that sender can't send to the company anymore. And just drop the mail. Although, if you've been hired to do the sneaky and you've outed yourself, you might see points dinged against you on the report. It's typically not a big deal if you get the access you need anyway, meaning if you get access to an organization and they catch you having done the phish, if you've already pivoted and you have a bunch of shells, it doesn't matter because you're already all over their land. So lesson number 16, details matter when you're pretending to be somebody else. Like Zaz said at DEF CON last year, don't fuck it up. So this is this is good. Fun times with physical assessments. It's a good idea to gauge if the tool that you're using is the one that you should be using to do the job. In this case, if you use the wrong tool on, say, a Kensington laptop tether, the tubular kind, and you destroy the lock, you've now basically permanently tethered this laptop to a desk. Or worse, if you destroy a combination lock that's keeping a shed shut or a gate shut or anything like that, you've basically permanently shut the lock until a bolt cutter gets involved. So lesson number 17, don't accidentally turn a lock into an insurmountable obstacle. Make sure that you don't overdo it. Lol. So many web applications have admin functionality for DB management and other sorts of functionality that will touch files or touch other things on the back end. A lot of web application scanners will just blindly scan every single form and hit every single button for the sake of testing. If you put those two together, you'll get deleted database, deleted databases, arbitrary files written to the disk, partitions that get mounted or unmounted, and all sorts of weird, bizarre stuff that's not supposed to happen. Backups of nothing, overwritten fields, and a lot of mayhem. So this sort of stuff is why people in the security industry make fun of what we call scan shops, places that just point a scanner at a website or a piece of infrastructure and walk away and do no other work. Companies that just run a tool against the site, they call that a pen test and they ask for money. Those sorts of shops tend not to get a lot of return business. So lesson number 18, don't nuke your customer's web app because you were easy about configuring your scanning tool. Ask these sorts of questions during the scoping call because this sort of mistake could cost the company the gig, or it could cost you your job, and it will definitely cost you return business. So when communicating risk to stakeholders, or in plain English, when telling people who are responsible for things that those things might have a problem that could ruin their day or month or week or year, it's important to be very selective about your language. I was told a story once by someone that involved finding a vulnerability in a school system, the realization that this could turn into a gig, then approaching the school and saying something like, and I quote, "I found you guys have this huge problem. I have the solution, but I'm not going to give it to you unless you pay me." I forget the exact details since this was several years ago, but I think the words blackmail or espionage were used, and the guy didn't have a good time. So lesson 19, words mean things. They really do. No matter how much you flaunt your disregard of the English language, the rest of us actually use it. Be precise with your words, otherwise you're going to have a bad time. The fun part about doing attack simulation is the part where you get a letter absolving you of any crimes that you commit on behalf of your company for conducting this assessment. It's kind of a get out of jail free card. They're really handy to have on your person if you're doing physical assessments. It gives you legal permission to attack the company like a real adversary would, and you wave it at police and they go away, which is kind of interesting. In these types of scenarios, you have a physical letter to carry around in case you get caught, so you don't actually go to jail. And in smaller engagements like external network pen tests or web app pen tests, the customer typically asks for the source IP address so that they can whitelist it or put it in a separate pile in their alerting tools to make sure that people don't actually conduct incident response on it. Or sometimes they do, depending on how black baggy the engagement is. Red team engagements are supposed to be stealthy, and when you're doing any of this kind of work, staying in scope is generally a really, really good idea. So I heard a story about a guy who decided to go way off reservation during a web application pen test, and since he wasn't getting his rocks off doing the web app pen test, he decided he'd throw in some social engineering for free. The short version that it went terribly, terribly wrong. He got caught and was basically fired on the spot, leaving his company to deal with the legal repercussions and a very angry customer because they thought that they were being attacked, and this guy basically effectively committing felonies because he thought that it would make him look better on the pen test. So lesson 20, scope is very important, especially on engagements where few people know that you're coming. Only give the customer exactly what they want and what they paid for. Anything extra in this case is like your stylist giving you free extra work during a haircut. It'll just leave you really pissed off, right? So it's routine to see attorneys getting involved with reviewing statements of work and the legal documentation pertaining to pen tests, and especially the wording and a lot of the details and talking points. The pitfall you can get into is if the attorneys realize that they can wedge themselves into the process and charge extra hours by changing the wording of documents in question to specifically cause the documents to need further attention by attorneys. Specifically, if you find that your statement of work for a pen test magically now includes incident response or remediation after the attorney reviewed it, you should make it clear that those are not typically part of a pen test. They're typically separate engagements and they cost extra. They also like to change the language in the contract protecting you from those 90% TCP session network derps, so they'll try and make that your fault. If they'll try and put into the document that if you tip over a firewall or you cause a production outage, that your company will be held legally liable, even though we know full well that they're 90% TCP session network derps running the shop. So if you breathe on it wrong, it'll tip over, and then suddenly you have a bizarre legal snafu to deal with. Lesson 21, if the attorneys are involved, you're going to have to put on your eagle eye goggles when you're reading the documentation after you get it back from the lawyers. It's not uncommon for them to slip something in there and hope that you don't notice it. So now that we have effectively 20, or I guess 21 landmines, let's talk about what happens if you step on one. So if your organization has a huge failure and it's not on the news yet, there are several ways to keep it quiet or at least lessen the blow. If customer data was leaked, then you're legally obligated to disclose that there was a breach. If there was no customer data leaked, then you're not legally obligated to disclose. So this can go two ways. One, you can try and hide it, but when the news finds out, you're going to look really bad. Two, you can cop to it and don't lie about your capabilities. The public would rather hear, yes, we got breached, we know what we did wrong and we're fixing it, stay tuned for an update on what we're trying to do to improve our security posture, but then you actually have to deliver. You can't make a statement like that and not deliver, otherwise you'll likely become targets again. Look at Sony. If I had to guess, I'd say that Home Depot and Target are also being attacked because of their lackluster public responses to breaches. Don't make yourself a target by lying to the press. Don't talk to the press unless you can legitimately say something reassuring. Bland corporate statements tell the attackers that you're only doing the bare minimum, and companies that do the bare minimum just continue to get owned. In large organizations, there's generally a PR or press department that will do all of the interfacing with the press for you. If you do your best to arm those people or that person with the proper nomenclature to not sound like an imbecile on camera, the better those folks look, the better your organization looks, and the better you look. They are the public face of your incident response, effectively. If you take the time, or take them to conferences, teach them how to pick locks, make sure that they're aware that hackers aren't actually scary and that we're friendly people. They will have your back and they will take the time to get it right. So attitude counts for a lot. In most organizations, the PR person who does all the interface, attitude counts for a lot. If you get on stage in front of the press and you sound angry or you sound defensive, it sort of goes back to the last talking point where you sound like it's a lackluster, bland public response, or if you don't own up to being owned and releasing tens of thousands or millions of pieces of customer records. you're again just making yourselves targets. You're telling secondary attackers that not only do we not care about the first attack, but we don't care if we continue to get attacked, which basically means that other attackers can continue to harp on your company, and they don't have to fear incarceration or any kind of legal recourse. Timing matters, especially when you're talking about public breaches and talking to the press. If you know that you've been breached and you have a company blog, you'll want to issue periodic updates on how you're doing in the remediation phases, especially if customer data has been touched. It's pointless to try and issue hollow or empty, bland corporate statements that mean nothing. If you want to avert the press digging into something that you said vaguely to try to hide the truth, then you want to make sure that you give the public what is reasonable to believe that they want before they actually have to ask for it. Give them a reason to think, wow, these guys are on top of this, and you'll very likely come out on top. Have a plan for when something breaks. Take the time to come up with scenarios of what would happen if, and play the part of the bad guy. Have a written, plain English plan for your operations team to follow if anything happens. It doesn't have to be formalized. It doesn't have to be stamped with the company logos. It can literally just be a turnover list, a bunch of talking like bullet points. It doesn't have to be wordsmithed for consumption. It literally just has to go to the people that will be doing incident response. It could even be a bullet point list. Preparing even a little bit goes a really, really long way during incident response. So during a breach, nerves will be frayed, people will be stressed, and they will be shouting and likely panic. People will interrupt you with lots of questions and demands for status updates, and during all of this, you'll likely be pressured and suffer some level of anxiety. It will help to have sources to look up findings. Here's a great one, intel.criticalstack.com. Sadly, I didn't put it on the slide because I'm an idiot. If nothing else, start with looking at firewall logs and outbound traffic on ports that your org doesn't use or countries that your org doesn't do business with. If neither of those pieces of data, if you have neither of those, then you'll want to get something like Security Onion on a VM or on some box, and you'll want to put it in line within your egress traffic as quickly as possible and listen to a tap so you can see what's actually happening. So here's a total of all the lessons learned. I have 2 minutes, so please take a photo or find me for the slides or something. I'll leave this up for a moment, but this is effectively the TLDR for the entire talk. That's a good point. Cressy says the get out of jail card only protects you from company claims and not state claims. So if you do something that makes the state or the federal government angry, the get out of jail card doesn't really help.
Like for example, if you're in a state that does not allow you to be in possession without being licensed, the company may allow you to pick the locks, but you're still in violation of the state statutes.
Fun times. And with that, thank you very much for allowing me to come and rant at you guys.